Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. I am your host, Keith Crockford, and I am back today with Jake. Hello, Jake.
Hello, Keith. How are you?
Very well, thank you. It's been a while since we've both been sat together recording one of these.
Well, we've just both been so busy. I can't actually think of a time where we've both been in the same country, let alone had time to sit down and record a podcast.
Exactly that. And we shouldn't have even been recording the podcast today because I was supposed to be interviewing somebody else today. And unfortunately, they are not very well. So I've had to go for the second best in drag.
I was going to say, so I'm second pick, am I?
Second pick, as always. That's what most of our customers say when they get you on a leading trip.
Second's the best.
And obviously, we had to quickly have a chat about what we were going to discuss today because I couldn't discuss what I was going to be chatting with my other guest about because I was going to be chatting about women's health issues on expeditions. So I don't think Jake's really the person to have that conversation with. So we had a quick chat and we were talking about what was going on at the Bucket List Company at the minute. And it came to light that it didn't come to light. We knew it was happening, but that we've got a Mera Peak expedition out at the minute. We've got an Island Peak trip coming up. And we were also yesterday discussing our Aconcagua trip in January that's happening. We've got a good group heading out to Aconcagua. So it kind of came clear that actually what we should be talking about is above 6,000 meters. And you know, for a lot of people start their mountaineering that they want to do a 4,000 meter peak. So, you know, Mont Blanc for many people is something that's on somebody's bucket list. Or for us, it's Mount Toubkal. And that's kind of our starting point for people who want to go into altitude trekking. So they might start off with Mount Toubkal, or they might go straight in with a Kilimanjaro or an Everest Base Camp trek and reach the high fives, but you know they don't quite creep over into the sixes. So obviously, once someone's done a Kilimanjaro trek or they've done an Everest Base Camp trek, they tend to come to us and say, "What's next?" And obviously, what's next for most people then is, if they want to continue with the altitude trekking, is to head over that barrier of the 6,000 meters. So that's kind of what we're going to be having a little chat about today, is what are people's options over those 6,000 meters. So do you want to start off with that one, Jake?
Yeah, so we've got a few options that take you over 6,000 meters. And 6,000 meters is quite funny because it's become this barrier, and on Kilimanjaro you get so close but you don't quite tip over the 6,000 meter mark, and it's almost become this little badge of honor amongst the climbing community, and you work it out. So you go above 4,000 when you do Toubkal, then you go above 5,000 when you do base camp and Kili, but you're just not quite at the 6,000. And then if you want to stretch over that,
and actually like you say, then like actually when you think about Kili, if you're going from 4,000, Toubkal's just under 4,200. You know, if you're then stepping up to Kili next, well, that's a 1,600 meter increase then in terms of, you are only 105 meters shy of the 6,000 meter mark on Kilimanjaro. And, so you are so nearly there.
It's so frustrating. You almost feel like if you stood on Kili and jumped, you'd almost be there. But yeah, in terms of what we've got with options to go back, a lot of people, naturally decide to go back to the Himalayas. I think if you want to go above 6,000 meters, you potentially got the drive to go higher. So a great starting point for a lot of people is Island Peak. Island Peak is just over 6,000 meters, but you also start to learn a little bit more about the technical climbing side of things. And I think that's actually still really kind of quite interesting for people to learn as they're developing. And Island Peak's a perfect training ground because the entire climb isn't like that. You do have a really nice approach Island Peak 6165, so it's actually only that little bit higher if you've done Kilimanjaro, so you should be fine with the altitude. But it does give you the chance to learn a bit more about fixed lines, using crampons, using ascenders, all that sort of stuff. So it's quite a natural progression in that sense. From there, if you don't want to use as much of the technical tools, shall we say, you could also go for Mera Peak. Now, Mera Peak and Island Peak are both still considered trekking peaks. So although there's a little bit of a technical side to them, we're starting to learn some of those climbing skills, they are both trekking peaks. So if you don't have any experience in mountaineering, then Island Peak and Mera Peak are great options for you. You get to go that little bit higher, and you also get to learn some of those foundation skills that will take you on to go and do much bigger and better things. So to kind of recap, Island Peak would take you to 6165, so 6,165 meters, and then Mera Peak would take you to 6,476 meters. So those are kind of the stepping stones.
I think if you think about Mera Peak, like Mera Peak is classed as Nepal's highest trekking peak. Like we've done several podcasts on Island Peak and on Mera Peak where we go into those treks individually in more detail. I think if you're comparing the two of them, then I mean it's a difficult one with Island Peak, because if you've already been to Everest Base Camp, then you are going to be going up in the same direction that you've done to Everest Base Camp. So pretty much for an Island Peak trek, you're going to head to Dingboche, and then you're going to continue on to Chukung from Dingboche, rather than coming across to Loboche on an Everest Base Camp trek. So you are going to be repeating quite a lot of an Everest Base Camp trek if you're heading out to Island Peak. We combine the two. So we do Everest Base Camp first, come back, and then you go and do Island Peak on our trips, which we kind of think gives you really great acclimatization, and you can kill two birds with one stone. Obviously, if you've done Everest Base Camp before, then you're fully aware of the facilities and the standard of accommodation, etc., on the way to Everest Base Camp. Obviously, on Island Peak, you've got a couple of days camping at the high camp, but you are still in the tea houses that you are going to have been spending your time in whilst you've been doing Everest Base Camp. I think the biggest challenge for a lot of people with Mera Peak is the difference. If you've done Everest Base Camp and then you choose to do Mera Peak, it is a completely different trip with completely different facilities. And, you'll both fly into Lukla. With Mera Peak, you hang a right when you get to Lukla rather than carrying on onto the Everest Base Camp trail. And because very few people hang a right, the facilities then are not as... I'm not going to use the word luxurious, because I don't think you can use the word luxurious on an Everest Base Camp trek. But when you're comparing Mera Peak to Everest Base Camp, like the facilities and your amenities that you've got on an Island Peak trip are going to feel like they are more luxurious than a Mera Peak. I would say Mera Peak is a true style expedition compared to an Island Peak trip.
I would agree with that. It's definitely got more of an expedition feel to it. You do spend longer in tents, and you end up having to carry a bit more equipment, and there's less facilities, if you like. The advantage of doing both of those is, as you say, they are kind of the last trekking peaks in Nepal, if you look at it that way, and then everything else from there, you then start getting into proper Himalayan high altitude mountaineering. What it does mean is that with the new regulations in Nepal, is that if you were to climb Island Peak and then Mera Peak, you would then be eligible to climb Mount Everest. With the new permits, you have to have climbed 2 6,000 meter plus mountains in the Himalayas in Nepal before you're eligible to climb Everest. And actually, if you were looking at it, then once you've done the two of them, you would technically be eligible. But a lot of people then look at doing something like Amadablum in the interim, because it gives you those mountaineering skills before tackling the higher altitude.
Yeah, another really one that we don't offer at the Bucket List Company, but another one that is really popular within the Khumbu region. So the same region as Everest Base Camp is Lobuche Peak, or Lobuche East, which is a great intro. Again, it's classified as a trekking peak. Lobuche sits at 6,119 meters. So again, you are over that 6,000 meters. And obviously Lobuche, if you've headed up to Everest Base Camp before, you might have seen, depending on what time of year you've gone, but actually at the bottom of Lobuche, you'll see the base camp set up there as you're trekking to Lobuche towards Everest Base Camp. So
yeah, we had that on it, just gone.
Yeah, it's another great one that we can add in. It may be something, Jake, that we look at for as an add-on at the end of an Everest Base Camp trek. Maybe it's something we can think about, because obviously, they could go to Everest Base Camp, turn around, come back, and then maybe do a Lobuche summit on the way back.
I would love to do Lobuche as a mountain. I think it's iconic. It's definitely one that people use as a bit of a training ground. And as you say, altitude-wise, it's not too much higher, but it does cross that 6,000 meter barrier, gives you some more skills, and it's a great training ground for if you want to go higher as well.
So I think it's one that potentially we could have a look at, about adding an add-on to an EBC trek. The fact that they walk past it on the way back. Now, obviously, it's not a quick little let's nip up Lobuche, but it would add a couple more days onto an Everest Base Camp trek. But again, we're looking to add on more trips and give people more opportunities. So, I think you're looking probably at another. I mean, I'd say it was probably going to be very similar to an Island Peak trek in terms of 3 days bolted on to an Everest Base Camp trek. But one that we'll definitely look at, because I think it could be really popular for us, especially with the amount of Everest Base Camp treks we are sending up at the minute. And I think, the problem with it is as we've said before on this podcast, it's very difficult when you get, like, people fall in love with Nepal. They fall in love with trekking in Nepal. And kind of once you've gone to base camp and you've looked around at all these mountains around you, you just then get this, I wish I was going to climb one of those mountains while I was here. And actually, Island Peak's a great one for that. Lobuche would be another great one for that. So let's have a chat with our team in Nepal and see if we can make that happen.
Yeah, I absolutely fell in love with trekking in the Himalayas, and Nepal specifically. It's definitely become one of my favourite places to go to. There's just something about it. So I love going back. I think we've got some incredible trips there. We've got lots of mountaineering trips, but the three big ones that take you over that 6,000 meters, and we'll look at adding Lobuche, I think, in the future, if there's the interest then. But yeah, the other ones that we got, as you say, Island Peak, Mera Peak, and Amadablum. That's kind of our biggest one that we've got in total. I would say Amadablum is probably the hardest trip that we offer at the bucket list at this stage by far.
And I think the reason why we added Amadablum was because people fall in love with Amadablum when they trek to Everest Base Camp. Like, Amadablum
in the world.
It's just so iconic. Like, you can see it there. It sticks out no matter which direction you look in. Like, people find it hard to decipher which mountain's which when they're in the Himalaya. But most people, once they've seen Amadablum once, no matter which direction you are looking in, you can pick out Amadablum. It's very iconic. So those are basically your options. And I mean, I certainly wouldn't suggest going from an Everest Base Camp or a Kilimanjaro trek straight into an Amadablum trek. But I would certainly
there is that one in between that we mentioned at the beginning, which is still considered a trekking peak. It is one of the 7 summits. So it's very, very, very high. But that would be Aconcagua. So we've got our Aconcagua trip going out in January. We've got quite a good group going out. We've got approximately 10 people on that trip. So that
I think actually, Jacob, we got one space left on that one, I think.
We've got, actually, no, you're right. We've got one space left, and then I'll be heading out with that group out in January. So Aconcagua is in Argentina. So one of the 7 summits for South America. It's the highest one in South America, 6,961 meters. So almost frustratingly just shy of 7,000. So you are.
It's like the Kilimanjaro of the 6,000 meter mountain.
It's more annoying because what have you got? You got about 105 meters. You said on Kili or something like that. Whereas this one, 40 or 39 meters. So it's crazily close. But yes, still a trekking peak. Nothing too technical. Very, very cold and sometimes, potentially that's going to be your biggest challenge is going to be the altitude and the weather. But you're not expecting big snow drifts like you would get on Amadablum. You're not going to be having any super technical climbing or anything like that. But yeah, that I would say for a lot of people, Amadablum is right at the top end. But I would say once you've done Everest Base Camp and Kilimanjaro, I would say a lot of people then look at doing either an island peak, a Mera Peak, or an Aconcagua. And I think that those are the 3 peaks that people kind of look at for going into next.
Yeah, and obviously I did a podcast a few months ago now with James, who was on our Aconcagua trip a few years ago. And I think it was such a great podcast where he went into it in so much detail and let people know about what to expect. And I think the thing with Aconcagua that's different to all the others is how it is like a proper mountain trip in terms of acclimatization. Like you have your base camp, you will go from your base camp and you will go higher, you will acclimatize, you will come back down to your base camp again, you will then go higher again, and then you'll come back down. So you are properly acclimatizing on the way. And that is that true mountaineering style that you see in all of the the films on the TV and Netflix and whatever. But yeah, again, Aconcagua, even though it is nearly 7,000 meters, it is still classed as a trekking peak in itself. Obviously, the lovely thing about Aconcagua, which I've said on many occasions before, is the fact that the climbing season for Aconcagua is in our winter, so January time in the UK. And obviously that is not climbing season out in Nepal. So the chances are there is nobody climbing out in the Himalayas at that time. So the chances are that when you are stood on top of Aconcagua, that you would then be the highest person in the world at that point, which I think is a pretty cool thing to say when you don't have to climb Mount Everest to make that comment.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very cool statement. There's a lot of appeal to Aconcagua for all of those reasons. It's the next step in terms of pushing yourself physically with the altitude. It's not too technical. And as you say, it's for a point in time, there's a very good chance you'll be the highest person in the world, which is a brilliant, brilliant claim.
Obviously you can't prove it at that point, but it's still something you
pretty good idea.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. That's where being tall helps as well, because if you are up with a group of people, you've got that extra little.
Yeah. And if you all stand on top of each other and there's 10 of you, you might get above the 7,000.
Somebody will get above 7,000.
But obviously as well, we've done loads of, we've talked loads about altitude as well in taking those next steps. And, we are partnered with the Altitude Centre in London, and we've done some podcasts with them as well, where we go into that. I mean, the part 2 podcast on altitude that Jake and I recorded a few months ago was after we had been there for testing, which I won if you saw the results. But Jake still
still controversial.
Results are results, mate. You can't. Data's data. But yeah, it's if it is something you are looking to do, then we strongly recommend that if you are able to get to London, and obviously, Jake every quarter runs a bucket list Saturday at the Altitude Centre where our clients all come together and they all go and get tested. They are proven to be really, really popular, and for the right reason, really. And ultimately, the results in the data that are coming out are correct, aren't they? I mean, if you look at you took a couple of people that went on your Everest Base Camp trek, went to the Altitude Centre, and they were pinpointed that they were going to struggle at altitude, and what was told at the Altitude Centre were the results, weren't they?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. I think that being able to give yourself, because it was never something that you or I really considered before we went and did our first treks and trips to altitude. Those
things didn't exist, Jake, when I went and did my first trek to altitude.
Well, they were still discovering half.
I still had hobnail boots in hemp rope.
But it was something where, like, the old way of doing it, and still a lot of people do it like this, is you turn up and you hope for the best, and your body either responds well or it doesn't, and you put training in beforehand. But yeah, a lot of people just go and hope for the best. But actually, what you can do now is go to places like the Altitude Centre, and the data that they're pulling and the simulations that they run are really, really accurate. Having been to altitude and then trying one of their tests at the centre, I was really quite impressed with how accurate they're able to replicate the feeling of being at altitude when you do the training. And then the data really doesn't lie. So yeah, we had a couple of people who came along to our testing. They had, it was picked up that they probably weren't going to perform very well on their respective trips with where they were at the moment. So they actually signed up to then go and do some training plans with the Altitude Centre. So that's something that you can do. You can go and visit them if you live close to London, or you can have a kind of a home testing kit delivered, if you like, that you can plug in and sort of hook up. Anyway, they went for these options, and the difference that it made when they came on our trip was remarkable. The data that they were showing and exhibiting at the Altitude Centre during their first visit was quite poor. Well, they made massive improvements, and then that was reflected when they were on the trips, because they had the highest, oxygen saturation levels of the entire group whilst on that trip. So it was really, really apparent that it made a difference. And what I would say to anyone listening is, if you are thinking about having done Kilimanjaro, having done Everest Base Camp, if you're thinking about going over that barrier to 6,000 meters, although it's very easy to say, it is a big step up, and it's totally achievable, but it is a big step up. And physically, I would recommend that you start, doing a bit more training, and maybe going to the Altitude Centre, getting that data and learning about where you need to focus on your training, because they'll really pinpoint, kind of specifics that you need to work on. And it makes a massive, massive difference. I'm actually going to be going at the end of the year, just going and doing a couple of weeks training at the centre before Aconcagua. Got quite a lot of the guys coming to do Aconcagua with myself. We'll be going and doing some training at the Altitude Centre as well. So we're just
are you going to wear those tight shorts again?
Well, I know how much you liked them, but you're not going to be there, so I might not.
I mean, for everyone else's sake as well, I wouldn't just as a guide for yourself.
But yeah, I would say if you are listening, it is worth heading along. And we do a Zoom call every month. So Nick and I will jump on a Zoom call every month and kind of discuss a lot of the theory about heading to altitude. So the 4 principles of performing at altitude, training that you can do in the build up to it. Even if you've got quite a stationary 9-to-5 job, there's lots of things that you can be doing during that time to improve, your fitness in preparation. And then, as Keith has mentioned, then once a quarter, we also do the in-person testing.
Perfect. So there we have it. There are our ideas for if you want to head out above 6,000 meters. If you've done Kilimanjaro, you've done Everest Base Camp, if the 7 summits are on your bucket list, then obviously, Aconcagua is in there as one of the 7 summits as well. And as Jake said earlier, there is a space heading out in January of 2025 on our Aconcagua trip. So if you've got Aconcagua on your bucket list and you want to get it ticked off, then contact Jake in the office and he can give you some more information on that trip. But we run that trip once every year. So if next year isn't the year for you, then then obviously you can think about it for the future. Likewise, we run several Island Peak trips a year. We run several Mera Peak trips a year. And Jake's going to hurry off in a second and try and get Lobichet East set up as well for the future. So if any of those trips are on your bucket list, then have a look in the show notes, because I will add links to those trips in our show notes so you can go and check them out. And what I'll also do as well is I'll flick through and find some of the podcasts that relate to those trips and put them in the show notes as well, so you can find them easily amongst the other 80 odd episodes that we have done so far of the Bucket Lister podcast. Obviously, with the podcast, it is great if you like and subscribe, because that sends all the right signals to Apple and Spotify and everywhere else where you listen to these podcasts. And hopefully you don't just listen to them to help yourself fall asleep in the evening. Jake, have you got anything else to add before we say goodbye?
No, not really. Apart from, if you haven't been to the Himalayas, Keith and I were talking about how much you will fall in love with trekking there. And I would just second that. I think that if you're looking at where's next on your bucket list, if you're listening to this and you haven't done the 4,000 meter, you haven't done 5.5, if these are all brand new to you, and you like the idea of going to 6,000 meters, then definitely look at starting in the Himalayas, because once you take that first step, it will change your life.
There we are. Jake said it there. It will change your life. Jake is guaranteeing that it will change your life. Well, everyone, thank you ever so much for listening. I will be back next week with another episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. But until then, thanks very much and goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.